Morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a minute, so I'd like to ask you all to take your seats. Remember, there's coffee and other beverages at the back here, so please make a stop there first on your way. We're going to start in about a minute. Well, everybody got so quiet so quickly. Maybe we'll get started sooner. Not waste any more time. Good morning and welcome to today's event. I'm Mark McClellan. I'm the director of the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. We are very pleased to have all of you with us today, both here in the room and online as part of our webcast to discuss policy options for addressing the challenges of off-label communication. This conference is being convened by the Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy. This is a new enterprise at Duke with offices here in Washington, and of course based on the Durham campus in North Carolina. And our team at the Margolis Center is very much looking forward to working with all of you on this topic, on many other related topics, as the center gets off the ground in the coming weeks and months. Today, however, we're focusing squarely on a topic that many of you joining us have worked on for quite some time: how to effectively communicate evidence about the off-label use of medical products to the patients, providers, and payers involved in healthcare decision-making. This topic, the regulation of off-label communication, has been a highly debated issue for decades, understandably, because a lot is at stake. On the one hand, opportunities to inform patient knowledge, provider knowledge, and therefore decision-making, but on the other hand, concerns about the misrepresentation or misuse of information that may not be as well-founded as the information on product labels. The reason that we think now is an opportune time for an event like this one and further progress is, as you'll see, there are a number of things happening both in the healthcare environment, in the legal environment, and at FDA that suggest this could be a time for real progress on achieving the goals and addressing some of the concerns about off-label communication. It's this sense of forward momentum that we hope our event today can contribute towards, and that's why we're very appreciative of having the diverse range of stakeholder perspectives that are represented on the paper that we're releasing today and in the panels that you're going to hear from this morning. The paper we're releasing was developed through an expert working group. Its goal was to lay out both the current state of the environment around off-label communication and promotion, as well as a number of policy proposals that we'll be discussing today that could help move these issues forward. These ideas of making progress come from the fact that now, again, seems like a time when presenting these options in the context of some new developments at FDA, new developments in the healthcare environment, mean that we could have further progress this year. Now, we're going to talk about all that in detail starting in just a few moments. Before I turn to that, I want to go over a few housekeeping items for our event today. I want to remind everyone that this is a public meeting and the event is being broadcast online. I'd like to also welcome all of our online participants today. So everything you say should be considered part of the public record. As you note in the agenda, there will be a number of panelists joining each session this morning. In addition to their comments and discussion among them, we want to set aside ample time for a broader discussion with all of you here in the room. And for those of you here in person, there are a couple of mics that they're set up towards the front of the room here. So when we get to that part of each of the sessions, please head up to ask your question and contribute to today's discussion. For our panelists, Serena Coates here in the front row is going to help you keep track of time during your remarks so we can keep on schedule and have time for that back and forth discussion. For those of you who are here today, we hope you found breakfast on your way in, and as I mentioned just a moment ago, coffee and beverages located in the back of the room. So that's our overall. That's our context for housekeeping. Let me now turn to setting the stage for today's discussion. As many of you know, the FDA only regulates the approval of medical products for use in patient care and the accuracy and reliability of the information going along with those approvals on the product label. FDA does not regulate the actual practice of medicine itself, and after FDA approval, medical providers can use the whole body of clinical evidence, the information on the label, other information that they can draw on as well, in support of their own decisions about using medical products. So that's label information. It's this so-called off-label information, which comes from an increasing diversity of sources today, as well as their own clinical experience. We're also living in an era when patients are much more actively involved in decisions than they used to be, and patients as well draw their information from an increasingly diverse set of sources well beyond the product label. So these decisions often involve prescribing outside the indications or settings on the product label, and this is exactly what we mean by off-label use. Estimates vary. According to some, 40% or more of medical products are prescribed off-label, and some surveys suggest that this percentage is increasing in some particular areas of therapy like oncology and psychiatry, or in pediatrics or geriatrics. The prevalence of off-label use appears to be even higher. The use of products off-label can take many forms. It can include use in an unapproved indication. It can include use in unapproved doses. It can include use for a duration that's different than on the product label. And it can include use in new areas where treatment options are limited. And again, this can vary by patient subgroup and by other factors as well. And this is also true for many orphan and rare diseases that currently lack adequate treatment options, and has been fostered perhaps as well by some of the recent trends towards opportunities in genomically based therapies or other more precision therapies that may not be on the medical product labels. In fact, in many areas, off-label use has become something of the standard of care. Whether prescribing on-label or off-label, let me see if I'm on the right slide here, whether prescribing on-label or off-label, patients, providers, and payers, as I've said, have a lot of different sources of evidence and data that they can potentially rely on to make treatment and reimbursement decisions. The sources of these data are increasingly diverse beyond the product label. They include drug compendia, include professional clinical practice guidelines, they include continuing education, they include primary literature, they include decision supports, they even include Google searches. These tools can be useful, but it is also challenging for frontline providers and patients to keep up with all of the information available, especially when they are crunched for time and spending, in the case of providers, seeing a lot of patients in a limited period of time. As the evidence on medical products continues to be generated through routine care as well, with increasing use of electronic data systems and information that is compiled from these systems, not from traditional randomized clinical trials, another source of growing source of so-called real-world evidence is also contributing to the decision-making of patients and providers in our healthcare system. Now, the regulations and mechanisms that guide this communication involve a number of different stakeholder groups and, as I've mentioned, have been a complex and challenging policy area. On the one hand, sponsors, the companies that develop and market medical products, have access to a lot of information about their products. They're the main place that has a responsibility for identifying potential safety problems or side effects and reporting those to the FDA. They're also the place where a lot of the evidence development has traditionally been sponsored about medical products, and much of that information is not incorporated into FDA-approved product labeling. On the other hand, it is FDA's mandate, understandably, to protect and promote the public health by safeguarding the public against potentially harmful uses of medical products, including uses that could be promoted by misuse or misinterpretation of the available clinical evidence. And this has led to a whole set of regulations and policies that aim to strike a balance between the concepts of active promotion and information dissemination. As we note in the paper, these two different concepts and the legal framework that goes along with them are both active in this area of this complex area of policy. Both types of communication are constitutional according to legal interpretations reinforced by recent cases. Both are constitutional if they are truthful and not misleading, but the regulatory role in overseeing communication activity is different for these two types of activities. Off-label communications that can be linked to the marketing of unapproved efficacy claims are considered promotion, and those are the ones that are more extensively regulated by the FDA under current law and regulatory interpretations. These off-label promotional activities are an area of public health concern, as I mentioned before, because of their potential to undermine the objectives of the legal framework for drug evaluation, drug regulation. That is to get accurate information out and to encourage the development of information that does meet high standards for reliability that people can count on in decision making. On the other hand, we live in an era of rapid change, rapid information development in healthcare, and more general communication about emerging studies and the underlying data for those studies, which are increasingly subject to transparency and disclosure requirements, are typically considered outside the bounds of FDA regulation, and they're routinely part of sponsor information dissemination, especially with other health professionals and increasingly with payers and health systems that are involved in new models of care to reduce costs, to use treatments efficiently. And these communications can play a very important role in advancing healthcare knowledge and supporting decision making. There's a fine line or a difficult line, a fuzzy line sometimes, between promotion and pure information dissemination that is difficult to draw and has been difficult to define consistently and clearly, and that's been associated with a number of important legal challenges and has implications for decision making as well. So any potential changes in existing off-label communications have to strike a difficult balance. I think I'll go back to the previous slide for this. The potential downside of these changes, in which FDA's regulatory authority over promotional claims of safety or efficacy erodes, could lead to instances of evidence being taken out of context or used inappropriately, and no better evidence being developed to supplement or replace it. And this could lead to worse results for patients, could lead to higher healthcare costs, and again, could undermine the incentives for developing better evidence. On the other hand, there are opportunities for greater clarity about the framework for developing and disseminating evidence, to the extent that more clarity can be provided there. That could result in both better care and stronger incentives for developing needed and relevant evidence in what is a very complex environment with very many different degrees of quality of evidence out there. One thing that is certain is that the current mix of policy and regulations and guidance documents and agency practices and statements in litigation and the like related to off-label communication, product labeling, and scientific exchange of information is not viewed as satisfactory to a wide variety of stakeholder groups and doesn't appear to be the optimal place for regulatory policy to stay for the longer term. FDA and Congress have taken steps to try to address these issues increasingly over the last few decades. Many of you may remember the 1997 Food and Drug Administration Modernization Act, FDAMA, which attempted to create a pathway for the dissemination of peer-reviewed journal articles related to off-label indications, so long as there was a commitment to filing a supplemental new drug application. That is an amendment to the label reflecting the information that was being disseminated. This effort largely did not succeed. That same year, FDA's new use initiative was designed to accelerate the development of evidence pertaining to supplemental uses of already approved medical products. This too didn't end up providing a clear avenue for getting evidence from off-label use onto product labeling more efficiently. By the way, all of these are detailed and provide more details on all of these developments in that background paper released today. Guidance documents were also issued in 2009 and 2014 by FDA to help lay out best practices for reprint distribution of scientific and medical publications, but those were also criticized for not providing as much clarity as many groups would have liked on key issues, when and how they can be used. And then getting this goal of getting to clarity has also been a key feature of some of the provisions related to off-label communication and use in the 21st Century Cures Act, the bipartisan legislation which was enacted by the House of Representatives last year. That legislation mandated new guidance related to off-label information dissemination and attempts to clarify and seek further progress on these issues as well. This legislation similar legislation is also being discussed in the Senate with a markup series of hearings taking place right now. Where this is going to turn out is uncertain, but the point is that there have been a number of efforts, including increasing recent attention, to get at this issue of more clarity and more effective policy in this very complex area of off-label communication and evidence development. The area has also been complicated by a number of high-profile recent court cases that have drawn more attention to challenging issues in sustaining current policies on off-label communication. These cases have focused on various aspects of a product sponsor's First Amendment commercial free speech rights to disseminate truthful and non-misleading information. The lawsuits include the 2012 U.S. versus Coronia. That's been viewed as a potential watershed case because it explicitly rejected efforts by the government to criminalize accurate speech about off-label uses. The 2015 Amarin Pharmaceuticals versus U.S. FDA case also has created increased pressure on FDA to develop new guidance. That case is in negotiations right now. And it's been stayed until March 18th to give you an idea of how timely some of these discussions are. And then Pacira Pharmaceuticals versus U.S. FDA, also from last year, as well, raised questions about the policies governing the role of approved labeling in sponsor communications. That case was settled in December. So you can see a whole series of cases, and it's widely expected that in the absence of greater policy clarity, there will be continued legal tests of the constitutional limits on the FDA's authority to regulate speech in this space, perhaps not the optimal way to set clear policy. That's another reason why the degree of interest in the issues that we're talking about today. So that leads to what we think are some opportunities for further progress in what is clearly a very challenging area. These come from the pressure for change, as I just described, from the recent legal challenges to current policies. It comes from the dynamics in the environment of medical practice and the role of different types of information, the sources of different types of information, including real-world evidence, the changing role of consumers, and as I'd like to end on in this introduction, some reasons to think that opportunities for further progress are at hand. A growing range of stakeholders are not only suggesting that more policy clarity is needed, but there are a number of ideas out there for what that policy clarity, what these next steps in policy might look like. For example, multi-stakeholder collaborations like the Medical Information Working Group have submitted citizen petitions to the FDA. The MIWG petitions describe a set of clarifications that they believe, again, it's a broad-based group that they believe are needed for more effective off-label communications policies. They specifically call for greater clarity around the definition of labeling, a good working definition of scientific exchange, as we've talked about in this introduction, and greater detail around the scope of intended use. FDA, in an indication that it agrees with the need for more clarity in these areas, granted these petitions in 2014. The agency publicly agreed to revisit and review policies in order to establish more clear standards for truthful, non-misleading scientific communication related to drugs and devices under investigation and off-label uses of approved medical products. The FDA also set out 4 areas that it would seek to harmonize through revising its existing guidance, including the FDCA pre-market review, labeling, and advertising provisions that apply to medical products, including important public health and safety interests served by these provisions, including the usefulness of disseminating this off-label information, and finally, including constitutional considerations related to the First Amendment and patients' rights, providers' rights to get access to information as well. Concurrently, there has been this bipartisan interest in Congress in getting to more clarity and path forward on these issues. As I mentioned, other groups have developed proposals as well, such as a very interesting paper recently from the Bipartisan Policy Center. So in short, there is a lot of foundation for potential further progress here, but we're not there yet. Important work remains to be done to implement an effective path forward on off-label communication and promotion policies. So I do think the efforts like the ones highlighted on this slide, like the ones highlighted in this the paper, help point the way forward for further progress, and what we're hoping to do today is build on those steps and help achieve that progress in 2016. Our agenda reflects these goals. In a few moments, our first panel will be joining me up here on stage to discuss the information needs and perspectives of a range of stakeholders, the means through which they access data and evidence today and are likely to do so increasingly in the future, and how current off-label communications policies do or don't help meet those needs and how they might be addressed. So as part of this panel, we've got a very distinguished group to hear from. Dr. Richard Shilsky from the American Society of Clinical Oncology. You can read about all of our participants in more detail in the background materials. I'm going to try to get right to the panel right now, though. So Dr. Shilsky is joining us from ASCO. Eleanor Perfetto is at the National Health Council, and we were hoping to have Ed Pizzella from Aetna joining us in person today. Unfortunately, the flights from Connecticut did not cooperate with that, so we'll have Ed joining us by phone, still up in Connecticut as a result of canceled flights up there. After we finish this first panel and the discussion surrounding it, we'll have a brief break, and then we're going to hear from a few members of our off-label working group who helped draft today's white paper, the paper that's being released today, for a little bit more detail and to provoke some discussion around the policy options presented in that paper. That includes Colleen Klasmeyer from Sidley Austin LLP, Mark Scheinesen from Alston Bird LLP, and Peter Pitts, the head of the Center for Medicine in the Public Interest. They're going to highlight the guiding principles and help us have some discussion around the potential policy options that were presented in the paper released today. Finally, we have a panel with 2 reactants that will share their thoughts on the proposed policies and potential next steps forward. This includes Dr. Josh Sharfstein, now at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, and Michael Listgarten from Genentech. And again, we want to hear from all of you here in the room as we proceed through these discussions. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and ask our first panel to come on up to the stage and hopefully get our phone line opened for Ed to join us from up in Connecticut. While they're going up, just again, we have Rich Shilsky with us. He's the Chief Medical Officer at the American Society of Clinical Oncology. Eleanor Perfetto, who's Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the National Health Council. And joining us by phone, I hope, Ed Pizzella, the National Medical Director for pharmacy policy and strategy at Aetna. Each of these participants is going to make a few minutes of opening comments to get our discussion going. Then we're going to have some back and forth discussion and then open up to comments from all of you. I think I'd like to start, assuming we've got the sound set up, with Ed on the phone. Ed, can you hear us, and can we hear you? And I'm taking that as a no for the moment. So with that, we're going to see if we can get Ed on the line properly. And in the meantime, Eleanor, I'd like to turn to you as soon as you're ready to start. Sorry to put you up on short notice here.
Am I on?
Should be, I think so.
Can you hear me? Yes,
Yeah.
sounds like you can. Okay, so I want to begin by thanking the authors of the paper for recognizing the role of the patients and how it's changed over the last few years, because we've really seen an amount of substantial change. Patients being engaged in all kinds of activities, from research to healthcare to policy. So recognizing that, I think, was a really important piece of this background paper. Patients need information to make better decisions, and to be able to contribute to the process. So it's not just their own personal decisions and the decisions for their families, but it's also getting engaged in some of the policy discussion and being able to be involved in the research. So they really need that information to be more active in that participation, have the capacity to really contribute to the process when they're becoming engaged in these other at these other levels. So that's an important piece of this. When they're needing information for themselves or for their family members, they're very often turning to their clinicians for that information. And you described it earlier, Mark, when you said that clinicians have limited time with their patients. They have a limited ability to keep up with the amount of evidence that's coming out every day. And so they're not always able to get that information from the clinicians. And we have to be honest, not all the clinicians are able to actually communicate it very well to patients when they're asking for that kind of information. So they do get as much information, and they do have that ability to talk to their clinicians when they have those kinds of questions, but there are barriers there that they have to deal with. So, they don't know that they can turn to a company to get off-label information. They don't know that they can ask those questions and get that information from the companies, that the companies are able to provide it when it's an unsolicited request. So that would happen very rarely. And so what do? Well, they do what we all do, and what we know that they do, they turn to the internet. And so we know that the information has a wide range in the quality that they're getting, in the clarity of that information. And so they're left to trying to interpret it on their own, or try to bring it to their physician to ask for more information. But again, there's not always enough time for that kind of communication. And there isn't enough, enough skill on the part of the clinicians to be able to wade through the stack of paper that a patient might walk in and hand them. So there are lots of barriers to access for truthful and non-misleading information when it comes to getting information from the sponsor, but there really isn't any barrier to the access of the Wild West of the internet. So they're getting bombarded by lots of information that's it's not truthful, it's not factual, it's misleading, but they have open access to that. But their company might have some factual information that could help them in their decision making, and that may or may not be getting to them, and it may not be getting to them in a very clear way. So I think we really need some new options to help overcome some of these issues. And we particularly need them for patients where that off-label use might be the only option that they have. It might be the only treatment that's out there for them, or it may be a new innovation, and they don't know that there's a possibility that they might be able to factor the benefits and the risks of that new innovation in for the condition that they have. So we need to reduce that lack of awareness. We need to have some options that can help patients reduce that lack of awareness so that they can have better decision making for themselves and for their families. We need to be able to have some of those barriers removed so that we can correct misinformation. when there's a lot of misinformation out there, patients need to be able to distinguish the quality information from the misinformation. We need to be able to use this information so that patients have the option to look at new and innovative options for themselves and for their family members. And we also need to figure out how we can provide this information so that patients can avoid barriers to coverage when off-label use is not covered, when it actually may be a very legitimate and appropriate treatment option for those patients, but the information is just not out there for them to know that and for them to be able to act on it with their providers. So with that, I would say that I was really interested in seeing some of the options that were offered in the paper, and I would really like to hear about some of the discussion around those options because they're very important for patients.
Great. Eleanor, thank you very much for that perspective. I'm going to try one more time to go back to Ed. Ed Pizzella, are you with us on the phone line? Can you hear me?
Good morning, Mark.
Good morning.
There in the room, hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine. Thank you very much for joining us.
Great, thank you. Well, this is an important and extremely timely topic. As Eleanor's pointed out, there is a lot of information available to people, but much of it is difficult to verify or to be sure that they're really getting good information from the internet, from social media, and other sources. And at the same time, we have a lot of medications being approved through the newer pathways, bringing them to market faster for patients who need them. But it also means that we need to be concerned about, do we have adequate information that is being developed along with those medicines, and continued development of evidence around the use of medications once they reach the market. So we look at this issue from two different parts. The first is what kind of evidence do we need, and what opportunities can that create for payers and pharmaceutical firms to work together. And then we have some concern, which we think that new policies and approaches can address. So for evidence, principally we look for evidence to support reimbursement decision-making, the development of coverage policies. And this sort of evidence comes in different varieties. It's usually clinical, economic, and social information. And oftentimes, there's pretty good clinical information around a medication as it comes to market. There might be some other questions about, another population and dosing, as was mentioned before. But many times, the economic and social data are not there yet, or only part of the picture. And these are things that we would like to be able to have more discussions with pharmaceutical firms about. And we can have those discussions in private. They're not making a claim. We're asking them directly about things. But it would be great to be able to have more of that information available for a wider discussion. So that is something that oftentimes becomes an issue when we're trying to do something else. So, for example, in support of an innovative or outcomes-based pharmaceutical contract, some of these contracts, we would like to see them contain financial risk for both parties. And we have had many pharmaceutical firms step up and say, yes, we're willing to discuss those sorts of terms. And we've had a few firms tell us, well, we can't sign a contract about economic outcomes because it's not in our label. So we want to be able to have those sorts of discussions and make sure that pharmaceutical firms are comfortable with these ideas, and that they can have a discussion that just because it's not in their label doesn't mean that we can't be working towards a goal that seems reasonable. We also need information for collaborations with providers, and this is extremely important that this information be available to everyone, not just us in private conversation, but that providers are able to see information about how a product is being used, what else is known about it besides the evidence that was clearly developed during the pivotal trials, and how can they use that information. And especially, we'd like to be able to see providers have access to negative information. That is, there was a trial somewhere it didn't make it to the label because it actually proved that it doesn't work in a particular condition or that the drug doesn't work for a particular kind of patient very well. And this will help providers by knowing, let's not try that. Somebody else tried it. It didn't look so good. We'll come back to that thought later if we're desperate, but let's move on to something else. So the negative information is important as well. Under concerns, we have some concerns that there will be less of a reason to do a rigorous follow-on study or phase 4 trial. And Mark touched on this during his remarks. We think that that's really important, that the manufacturers and the FDA essentially create the gold standard for data by trying to do things that will get into the label. And if there's less need to get into the label, then we are concerned that we will have less rigorous and good trials following approval of medications. And so we'd like to be able to see continued good studies being done, supported by the sponsor, and in some way that these trials can continue to move ahead, and that we know that they're good studies. Peer review has taken on sort of a different context these days because it takes a long time to get a study into a journal, and a lot of things are published as abstracts and in advance of the actual publication, and this leads to a lot of partial information being available. And so we'd like to see industry working on some approaches towards making sure that we get good data, that perhaps there are more repositories of trials that had negative data, and of trials that had positive data, of studies that are being done outside the label, and a discussion of their methodology and rigor as we move along. But we think that all of this still leaves us with some, very important steps that we can take to move the information forward, to be able to learn more about the social and economic impacts of using pharmaceuticals, and that we can develop better evidence that can be made available to both providers and patients as well as payers to counteract anecdotal evidence, to counteract speculation, so in closing, I just want to say that, we welcome a review of this topic and new thinking around the policy, and we want to be sure that we have good data for a number of new sorts of things, collaboration, outcomes-based contracts, and those things, but that we continue to have appropriate data around efficacy and safety so that we can continue to help the FDA and others to make sure that there's access to appropriate medications. Thank you.
Thanks very much for joining us by phone. You came through very clearly. I'm impressed with the technology. Great to have you with us. So now I'd like to turn to Rich.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Good morning, everyone. So I'm a medical oncologist. I worked for nearly 30 years at the University of Chicago before joining ASCO as their chief medical officer 3 years ago. So I'll be speaking from the perspective of the physician and more particularly the perspective of an oncologist. It's clear, there are a few things that are very clear. First of all, it's important to remember, doctors don't read drug labels. Okay, if you go to any medical meeting and ask for a show of hands as to how often a doctor reads the drug label, no hands go up. So although we rely a lot on the information in the label, we don't get that information from actually reading the label in most cases, and someone has to present that information to us and draw our attention to it. Physicians are used to accessing and reviewing data from a large variety of sources. And oncologists in particular tend to be sort of early adopters of new information because our patients have so many unmet medical needs. So we're always scanning the literature. We're going to ASCO and other meetings and listening to abstracts and learning what's going on and trying to decide what we feel is appropriate to adopt into our clinical practice and so on. So off-label prescribing in oncology in particular historically has been very high, continues to be high. Mark noted a figure of about 40%. A year or so ago, one of my University of Chicago colleagues, Rena Conti, who many of you know, published an analysis in the JCO looking at off-label prescribing of oncology drugs in the year 2010. And 70% of the prescribing was on-label, which I actually thought was remarkably high. 30% was off-label. Of the off-label use, half was supported by clinical practice guidelines or compendia listings, but half wasn't supported by any recognizable medical evidence. And that amount of prescribing, the unsupported prescribing, was estimated to cost about $2 billion a year to the healthcare system. So I think it's important to keep in mind. There were some interesting examples in that paper, and I don't want to harp on it, but I have some hypotheses at least to offer as to circumstances in which off-label prescribing is actually done by oncologists. So I know we have some colleagues from Genentech here today, and without either picking on or highlighting them in particular, 3 of their drugs appeared in Rena's paper, and I thought the data was very interesting. Herceptin usage was 99% on-label. Avastin usage was 48% on-label, and Rituxan usage was only 33% on-label. So you might say, why that broad range? 3 important, highly effective drugs. Well, of course, Herceptin usage is really only medically appropriate in tumors that are HER2 overexpressing. So that's a sort of a point of access to even prescribing the drug in that circumstance. It leads to the supposition that if you have a drug that is only indicated for use in a biomarker-defined population, that might actually in some ways constrain off-label prescribing, because the first thing you have to do is ascertain the presence of the biomarker. The alternative hypothesis there is that as there's more and more genomic profiling of tumors being performed and some of these drug targets are being discovered in off-label disease settings, it might promote off-label prescribing, because there's a tendency to say, well, if the target is there, maybe I should just give the drug a try, whether it's even though it's off-label. In the Avastin setting, my hypothesis at least is that the reason that there's a lot of off-label use is because that's a drug that tends to be used across multiple lines of therapy, many of which may not actually appear in the drug label. And in the Rituxan circumstance, I think the off-label use there is largely because it's such a highly effective drug across a whole range of B-cell malignancies, and the information is out there in the medical literature that doctors tend to use the drug, in various circumstances where it's shown to be effective, but where that particular indication might not be on the label. So these are things I think we have to keep in mind, and the real issue is, how does the doctor get this information and assimilate it into their practice? And I would suggest that as a physician, if information is coming my way, I want it to have certain characteristics. Ideally, it should be complete. And what I mean by that is, I don't want somebody coming in and telling me about 2 arms of a 3-arm clinical trial, or omitting certain important toxicity data, or things of that sort. It's got to be accurate. So the information that's provided has got to be a true representation of the information that's actually available. It should be balanced. So, if there's 3 new clinical trials out there that I might need to know about, and, 1 is positive and 2 are negative, don't just point me to the positive one. And it's got to be from a reliable source. And I think, again, as a physician, my strong preference is for whoever is pointing me to this information to do just that. Point me to the data. Don't digest it for me and deliver it in a soundbite, but show me where I can find the data so I can evaluate it for myself. I think we have to consider how doctors might use this information in clinical practice. To me, information about off-label uses has to be considered with respect to the risks to the patient population. Again, keeping in mind that a lot of off-label use, in a sense, is related to the fact that most patients that we treat are not well represented by the patients who were in the clinical trials that led to the development of the drug label. So, if you have a patient with a poor performance status or abnormal organ function, that might be technically an off-label use. But you still want to treat that patient, and you still want information about the tolerability of the drug in that patient population. So as a physician, we have to consider, what are the risks to the patient in front of me? What are the alternatives for that patient? Maybe it might be a better alternative to enroll that patient in a clinical trial than to put that patient, to treat that patient with an off-label product. And what are the goals and preferences and financial resources of the patient? Again, I think there are certainly off-label prescribing situations where that treatment option is the best treatment option for the patient, well evidence-based, highly effective, safe, and so on. There are other off-label prescribing situations which are a last gasp, where there's limited evidence of efficacy, there may be unexpected toxicity, and there'll certainly be a lot of incremental cost. And I think, as Eleanor was saying, we have to consider all of these factors in discussion with patients in making a decision to prescribe off-label, but it's all driven by having complete and reliable information. Finally, and several people have touched on this already, because of the fact that the drugs are generally more effective today than ever before, because we have more and more biomarkers to identify populations of patients most likely to benefit, because of some of the FDA's new authorities and pathways, drugs are being introduced into the market earlier and earlier in their clinical development than ever before, which essentially means that we have much less information about the drug when it's introduced into clinical practice, and much less information in the drug label. So we have a lot to learn about many new drugs when they're first introduced, and much of the information that we wish to have is not in the label because it hasn't been developed yet. So there has to be ways of either getting new information into the label quickly and efficiently, and from sources that are not necessarily just follow-on clinical trials, because those trials take a long time to complete, they're expensive, and in fact, we know from experience that in many cases, post-marketing trials are never successfully completed for a variety of circumstances that have been, discussed in many other settings. So we need other solutions for how to gather the data, how to present the data, and ideally, from my point of view, at least, the more data that can find its way into a label, perhaps in some tiered setting, so that there's the information that's officially on the label, and then there's other information that is supported by certain levels of evidence that might be appropriate for discussion, but is not an official part of the drug label. The more that's in the label, or the more that's in compendia, or the more that's in clinical practice guidelines, the more confidence that physicians will have in the reliability of that information, because they know it's been vetted in some way by some independent group of experts, who have in some way validated the information. And the final thing I'll say is, we have various terms that are thrown around in this white paper. One set of terms where there's some tension is between promotion and dissemination. And I'll just say, when I read that, as a physician, what those terms connote to me is promotion is somebody telling me I should use this product. Dissemination is somebody telling me I could use this product in the appropriate medical circumstances. Those are two very different messages to a physician, and I think the obligation that we all have is to point out to physicians where a product could be used, but leave it to the judgment of the physician and the discussion with the patient about whether or not it should be used. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. I want to thank all three of you for comments. And Ed, I think we've still got you on the line, so if you don't mind, we'll be coming back to you as we move forward with this discussion. Eleanor, I wanted to start that discussion by coming back to you since you got to go first, and you highlighted this what you called the Wild West out there in terms of a lot of information, not coming from sponsors directly, but a lot more information maybe than there used to be of variable quality that could have an impact for better or worse on patient decisions. I wonder if you might comment on what you've heard from the other perspectives, from Ed at Aetna, from Rich from a clinical perspective at ASCO, where all seem to want to get something more meaningful in this ground that's outside the increasing what sounds like from all of your comments, kind of the more narrow area within the bounds of the product label, with so much more information coming after drugs get approved, with so much more such a diversity of sources of information out there. Can you say more about how that might fit, how you might develop a better space for useful information for patients that goes beyond what they can get from the label today?
Sure. Well, I think it goes without saying that patients don't read the label either. So you've got tiny microscopic writing. They don't understand most of what it says. So patients aren't relying on the label either. They're relying on all this other information. There are studies out there that if you ask patients where they get their information from, they're getting it from family members, they're getting it from friends, and they're getting it from the internet and social media. So without having any filter to help them in figuring out what's a good piece of information and what's a bad piece of information, it's really difficult for them. And you have these conversations where you hear about the crazy things that someone learned from what they read or something that they're trying, and you have to try to figure out ways that they can get better information and at least have some way of discerning the good from the bad and the wheat from the chaff. I think one of the things that we see happening, at least among the membership of the National Health Council, which is many of the large and small patient advocacy organizations, those organizations do a very good job of providing information to their patients and helping them get through that. So, we would of course like to see patients who have a particular condition go to those national organizations that represent patients and help to provide them with some of that information, that they have clinicians and others who have gone through that information and help with putting out the clinical practice guidelines, helping them to understand and interpret those guidelines, the work that ARC and other organizations and PCORI are doing in this area to help patients get that information. So there are sources out there. It's just a matter of helping patients figure out which sources are the ones that can really help direct them to some information that has in some way been juried, if you will, and examined in some way to help not only pick out the information that's bad and provide just the information that's good, but also be sure that it's it's been presented in a way that's understood by the patients and the family members who need to use that information in their decision making.
I'd like to go from that to picking up on a comment that Rich made about these kind of different grades of evidence and maybe getting some help in sorting through it. Rich, I think what you said you wanted to look for was, especially for this information that perhaps isn't as comprehensive as might be needed to make a clear label claim on a current product label, at least getting information that's complete, that's accurate, that's balanced, that points to all of the relevant underlying data. And with all the push towards data transparency, there are more data out there than there used to be. To push ahead to one of the options discussed in the paper talked about some pilot programs where manufacturers might more actively participate in the development of those kinds of programs, perhaps whether it's through something like what you were describing, Eleanor, at the National Health Council or other groups. Rich, I want to come back to some of the work that ASCO is involved with in this area. But Ed, if you are still with us on the phone, we had heard from you about some of your interests around, you are part of the payments side of things, but very interested in new kinds of contracting models that aren't selling drugs based on volume, with payments based on volume, or rather payments based on results for patients and efficiency gains in the healthcare system, things that would seem to require a lot of new types of information exchange, particularly with manufacturers who have a lot of that information. Could you expand out on how you see what you see might maybe being good steps to support the expansion of those programs and the inclusion of manufacturer information in them?
Great, thank you, Mark. Yeah, I think that there's a number of things that we are doing with manufacturers. There's been some recent publications about outcomes-based contracts because there was sort of a drop-off in the number of contracts signed in the U.S. over the past couple of years, and now there's a resurgence of interest in these sorts of arrangements based on a number of different outcomes. Some of them are based on clinical outcomes, and some of them are based on economic outcomes. And many of the reasons for doing an outcomes-based contract have to do with uncertainty. That if we're quite certain that the drug is going to perform in a particular way and that performance is going to result in a particular outcome for a patient or a particular level of cost, whether it's increasing or decreasing costs or improving efficiency, well, then there's not particularly good reason to have to do a lot of contracting around that. We just negotiate what we hope is a fair price and move ahead. But many times we have a medication where we know that there is an intermediate measure that is improved, and we'd like to know that the drug is going to also improve a more definitive outcome measure for a patient. So that perhaps the drug improves ejection fraction or reduces cholesterol, and we really want to know that it improves cardiac performance, reduces the risk of cardiac events, and that would then lead to less utilization and lower costs. And not all of those things are in the label. When the drug hits the marketplace, you can't have 20-year studies, do all this stuff before the drug comes out, and we completely understand that. And so having whatever information is available for the medication at that time can help us to say, well, we think that the trend will be in a particular direction, and so we'd like to be able to build on what evidence there might be to create one of these contracts. So I think there's a real opportunity there for those sorts of discussions. The other opportunity is in having a broader discussion around what a particular sort of measure means. So if the drug is approved based on a score, a clinical score, let's have a discussion around how that clinical score can translate to a sort of more concrete sort of patient outcome around the patient's ability or disabilities.
Thanks, Ed. And Rich, I think you had some comments I would categorize as being along the same lines. You highlighted some of the new developments in accelerated approvals, especially for breakthrough therapies or potential breakthrough therapies in oncology care. You highlighted the role of increasing role of genomic testing. Again, seems like an area where lots more evidence being developed, especially in the post-market setting, much of which is not on the label and maybe not rising. Not the level of evidence that can rise to it now. What are you all seeing at ASCO? You've done a lot of work around trying to promote better, more accurate information on precision medicine. I know some of that work has highlighted the variable and sometimes hard to reproduce results of the genomic testing, which further complicates learning about whether a genomic profile really matters for a patient's outcomes. Can you say a little bit more about how doing something on off-label promotion or off-label communications policies could help support those efforts?
Well, before I respond directly to that, let me just point out that I think in the context of this meeting, there are sort of two streams of discussion going on, and I think we need to decide where the focus should be as we go forward. One is the stream about continuing evidence development and the mechanisms to do that. And I think everybody would agree that we need to continue to develop evidence. It needs to be reliable and accurate and complete and balanced and all those things that I mentioned. And everybody wants good quality information, no matter what domain we come from. To some extent, that's the easy part, because we know what information we would like to have, and we know what the variety of mechanisms are that could develop that information. I think the main issue in this meeting is what evidence can actually be communicated by a pharmaceutical company to a provider if it's not incorporated in the drug label. And that's a very different type of discussion, because we may have fabulous evidence developed through all sorts of different mechanisms, but if it's not in the label and therefore it can't be discussed by the company. And I would submit that there's no stakeholder that is either more interested in or more knowledgeable about a drug product than the commercial sponsor of that product. I mean, it's their drug, they know about it, they developed it, they want to continue to learn about it, they want to be sure it's used in a safe and effective manner. And so the question is, they also want to sell it. I mean, I think we have to be honest here. Maybe that's where some of the tension exists, in all of this. To get back to your question, I know that the time is limited. I mean, genomics really does introduce, in my mind, the real Wild West here, because first of all, most oncologists don't know how to interpret the genomic information. A lot of it, we're still developing the evidence around in terms of what is a, clinically and biologically important variant in a gene that might be discovered in a genomic profiling test. We know that context is important. We know that not every drug target in every context is inhibited equally effectively, or the drug works equally well against that target in different clinical settings. And yet, none of this is information that gets into drug labels. And so doctors have to be guided by, what they hear about, what they learn about in meetings. We're trying to address this in part in ASCO through our TAPER study initiative, which is essentially a mechanism that we've established now to learn about the off-label use of targeted drugs in patients with advanced cancer who've had a genomic profile performed on the tumor that's revealed some actionable variant. And that's a mechanism of evidence development. But the question will come, as we develop evidence through that mechanism, how can that be communicated by the 7 drug companies that are participating in TAPER to providers, because it'll all be off-label information. So, certainly ASCO will take an important role in communicating that information, but the companies who are major stakeholders in the study are sort of, locked out of the opportunity to communicate that very same information in the current system.
I want to reiterate that too, because it's true for patients also. I think patients are less concerned about the evidence that doesn't exist. Of course they want to see that. Of course they want breakthroughs for the therapies where there are no therapies. And that's an issue, but they're very concerned about the information that exists and they don't know about it, and because it can't be communicated to them. So, an example that I've heard is the HPV vaccine, human papillomavirus vaccine, that the age restriction that's on the label is up to the age of 26, but that in some communities, like the gay men community, that there are instances where it would be very appropriate for that community to be using, but they don't have access, they don't know the information even exists that it could be beneficial to them over the age of 26. So it's one of those areas where there's information out there, but they don't even know about it.
Yeah, I think you all, both your comments highlight, as Rich mentioned, the difference between sort of agreement on the need for continued evidence development, and I guess would add to that appropriate use, in the overall context of information available, and the role of product developers in communicating about that information. One would hope that the second could support the first. And I just want to make sure that we're pushing as much as possible on, Rich, what you said is the nub of the challenging issue here, which is what is the role of product developers in this process. Is it working in taper? Are there ways in which a different role for product developer communications could play a bigger role there?
Well, we'll find out. I mean, taper is just going to launch next month, so it'll take a little time yet before we actually have real information coming out of it. But I do think that, one of the goals of this meeting and whatever the follow-on activities of it might be, and because there'll clearly need to be some, is that, we should try to work with the FDA and, other relevant agencies to come up with strategies that allow reliable and well-vetted information that's not in the drug label to be communicated by the sponsor to the providers and to patients. And I think the key issue there is that there should be some independent assessment of the information so that this tension between, wanting to communicate information and wanting to sell drugs is dissipated by, a third-party analysis of the quality of the information and its reliability and its appropriateness, in different clinical contexts. At the end of the day, as you said at the beginning, it's up to the doctor to practice medicine, based upon the doctor's knowledge and, and engagement with the patient. But the doctor still needs reliable information and has to be able to get it from a reliable source.
Right. And that notion of some reliable source of information, some independent assessment is something we're going to come back to in the later panels today. Ed, I wanted to go to you for one more question, and for those of you who are here, I want to open this up to comments and questions from the audience. Rich pointed out the desire of manufacturers to sell more product being an important fundamental consideration on policies here. Ed, you talked about some of the reforms that you're implementing where, if I'm following you right, the incentive for the manufacturer becomes less about or not only about selling more products, but actually about demonstrating improvement in the outcomes and the costs of the patients being treated. Have you found in that environment that the role of manufacturer communication might be different and might need support from different kinds of policies?
Thank you, Mark. Yes, I think we're going to need some different sorts of policies here because as we're discussing these outcomes-based contracts and other sorts of collaborations and arrangements with pharmaceutical manufacturers, some of it has very little to do with directly increasing the amount of pharmaceuticals that they sell. And pharmaceutical manufacturers not only know a great deal about the individual pharmaceuticals, they know a great deal about the therapeutic area in which the pharmaceuticals should be used. And they have a lot of understanding of its interaction or potential interaction with other drugs, both good and bad. And so we're hoping to tap into that knowledge and experience of people in the pharmaceutical company to help us. And so some of the manufacturers, for example, are entering into outcomes-based contracts with us. We have a number under discussion, but there are parts of the agreement that are not related to the drug and are related to other sorts of activities, whether it's education for providers and office staff. Some of it is value-added programs for the patients, and some of it is more direct activity around, say, medication adherence and those sorts of things. And drug companies have spent lots of money dealing with these issues. They understand a lot about it. And so we're hoping to harness that. And so having open discussions around things like what exactly are the adherence barriers to people using this particular medication. So that may not come up ever in a label, but it might be an important topic in choosing one drug over another or one approach over another because you discover that patients maybe are more willing to take something twice a day than once a day if there's fewer side effects. So there's lots of other information that's really important, and pharmaceutical firms know a lot more about it than we do, and so these partnerships can be very helpful. And bringing the providers in is also important, and that's where we get to where we have to be able to have open discussions about these sorts of information.
So, this is Rich Shilsky. So I'm just curious as a follow-on to your comment. I mean, as you've had these discussions with the pharma companies, and I think you mentioned this in your opening remarks, to what extent is their ability to, enter into these agreements with you constrained by the fact that they can't do off-label promotion? So, I mean, if you talk about things that are potentially beneficial to patients that you want companies to undertake, as part of some value-based contractual agreement with the payer, but they can't actually do that legally because it could be construed as off-label promotion. Aren't you just sort of stuck in the mud?
So we are stuck. I mean, there are some pharmaceutical firms who have said, well, we're willing to enter into a contract around economic outcomes, even though they're not mentioned explicitly in our label, because generally a lot of economics are not mentioned in labels, and because it's a direct follow-on from the clinical activity that the drug has, and that is in our label. And sometimes we use some proxy measure for the utilization management or financial outcome, and instead focus on those clinical outcomes. And in some cases, utilization is explicitly mentioned. So we just announced, for example, that we partner with Novartis on the new drug for heart failure, Entresto. It's a drug that has a lot of promise for helping patients with low ejection fraction, and reducing hospitalizations actually is mentioned in their label, and so that is something that we could contract on. But there have been other firms that say, well, we can't go there. We can't do anything that's beyond just these couple of endpoints because it's not in our label. So we have found that does cause the contract to hang up, and so we have not been able to proceed with some opportunities because of that. So you're right. There are instances where it just doesn't move forward because of concerns that a contract will look like they're promoting off-label.
Thanks for the comments, Ed. It really is good to be able to hear you clearly, despite being up in Connecticut. Let me open up this discussion to those of you who are in the audience with us today. If you have a question or comment that you'd like to make, please head up to one of the microphones at the front of the room. Be glad to hear from you. Since this is a meeting about communication, I'm hoping that a lot of the audience members have some thoughts that they'd like to communicate. Lee, you want to go ahead? And please identify who you are.
Thanks, Mark. Good morning. Lee Rucker, independent policy consultant. My firm is called Enhanced Value. You had mentioned the research done by one of your former colleagues on the extent of evidence-based, if you will, off-label use, and I had pulled out another one done in 2012 by Robin Tamlin and co-authors. At that time, they found 11% off-label use, of which 79% was not scientifically based, if you will. What's interesting about this study is that they went to Quebec to do it. It was a 5-year study. They went to Quebec because they were able to track through their electronic health records the indication, which was mandatory. So my question is, how can we even begin to systematically track off-label use if we don't have the indication? And interestingly, ARC does have a study undergoing now exploring the potential for adding indication in the EHR through Gordy Schiff is doing that. So wondered your comments.
I think you can get I think you can get that at least through claims data, because generally speaking, you have to have an ICD-9 or 10 code in order to be able to bill for a particular drug or a particular medical encounter. So there is so that in a sense, tells you what the indication is. So it may not be explicitly in the EMR, or it may be difficult to extract from the EMR because it may be, an unstructured data in the physician note. But I don't think it's impossible to get the information. It's just you have to know where to look for it, and it may not be that readily available. And of course, it's not then in the context of other kind of information that you might also want to have.
It seems like we're also opportunities for progress there, where the ability to link in information from electronic records, key diagnostic information is increasing. That's probably built into the taper work that you mentioned before. And again, going back to your comments, having more of a clear pathway for how, if manufacturers help support the development of that information, it could actually get used and communicated. Maybe that would facilitate some more progress. We've got time for a couple more questions.
Hi, Firdaus Al-Farouk with The Gray Sheet. I'm a reporter. I was looking through the report really quick, and from what I can tell, there's like 3 specific policy kind of things that you present. I was kind of interested because, when we talk about off-label, we don't a lot of times remember that maybe there's some off-label issues with medical devices. I was wondering, when you were working through your working group, did you guys ever discuss off-label use and how it would impact maybe the medical device industry? And are there any specific policies that you presented that would really affect the industry?
Great question. I don't know if any of the panelists for this panel have any comments on that. That is one. Maybe I can hold that for next panel.
I would just say that one important issue there is first getting the medical device a label. Since many of them are never have a drug label because they're never actually reviewed by FDA. And therefore, it's hard to know what's on label and what's off label when there's no label to begin with.
Well, it's mostly off label, I would guess.
Mostly
in that
predominantly
case,
off-label.
which hopefully we'll have time to come back to that. Great question. Go ahead.
Good morning. I'm Paul Brown. I'm with the National Center for Health Research. My question is on evidence for adverse events on label versus off label. Since there's 40% off label use, do we have some studies that show if there are more or less adverse events for products used off-label than compared to on-label?
Well, I'll just say from the cancer drug point of view, one place where this becomes evident is oftentimes in analyses of SEER Medicare databases. Because the number of older people who are actually included in the clinical trials of drugs that are approved by the FDA is, much smaller than the proportion of the population who of a certain age who have cancer, right? I mean, so cancer is most common in people 60 or 65 and older, but only about 10% of people in that age range, and even a smaller percentage of people 70 and older actually participate in clinical trials. And so most of the people we're treating were never represented in the clinical trials of the drug. And so when you look at SEER Medicare analyses, which of course are, include patients 65 and older by definition, what you almost always find, comparing that information to the clinical trial data that supported the marketing of the drug, is that the efficacy is a little bit less and the toxicity is a little bit more in the older age population. And, specific toxicities could be a lot more. So there are ways to get that information, but it's not as granular as we would like because of limitations in the information that's available in the Medicare claims database.
And the other part of it also is that sometimes off-label means a different dose, and so it's a little bit harder to tease out when it's not a completely different indication. It's a change in dose, and it's much easier when you're talking about the off-label use as Avastin, and so you're seeing a markedly different adverse event. As opposed to just a change in dose.
And this information about dose, I know we got to end, but I just want to point out is really important. Yeah. A year or two ago, at one of the Friends Brookings meetings, we had a panel on dose optimization. And the FDA came to that meeting with a list of at least half a dozen drugs already FDA approved, where they were convinced that the labeled dose was the wrong dose. And the drug manufacturer, was undertaking a number of post-marketing studies to try to refine and improve the dose. And, every oncologist knows, just to reflect on an old drug, every oncologist knows that the labeled dose of Xeloda is too high. and virtually no patient can tolerate that dose right out of the box. So, how that information is supposed to actually be communicated until the label can be modified and updated is a little bit unclear. And yet it's extremely important because there are patients out there who are either getting underdosed or in some cases overdosed, and yet the manufacturer technically can't really talk about giving anything other than the label dose.
Can I also add one more thing too? That one of the things that labels don't include at all, regardless of whether it's on label or off label, they don't include patient preferences. And so we're having more discussion now about whether or not we have the ability to be able to incorporate patient preferences into the label. So there may be some efficacy endpoints or some side effect endpoints that have been incorporated into the label, but we don't really have a very good feel for how important or not important they are to patients and what they're willing to trade off in their decision making. And so that it could be that you see this number go up in terms of adverse events, but patients will say to you, well, that's not something I care about because I'm balancing that with the efficacy endpoint that I care about. So, we have a long way to go to get there, but sometimes those numbers don't mean anything to patients.
Great. Thanks, Eleanor. Time for one more question.
My name is Ariel Zena. I'm with the Smarter Healthcare Coalition, and I really appreciate all the comments made so far, and I think the benefits of off-label communication, they're ample. But to push us a step further, I wonder if you could maybe speak on the potential opportunities or potential negatives of off-label communication and the effect on drug pricing, given that presumably drug prices are set on the expected use, which is often tied to the indicated use on the label. How would you see this type of communication circling back? And is that an opportunity potentially to reevaluate prices, or do you think that's a challenge that could occur with increasing indication without formally doing so on the label?
Ed, if you're still with us and heard that question.
Yes, thank you. That's an interesting question, and I really can't speak for the pricing committees at pharmaceutical firms. I think that it's usually taken into account as you say, what the utilization of the drug will be, and oftentimes I think they're rather careful to assume that the appropriate patients, the patients that are similar to those in the trials, will get it for the indications that were studied in the trials, and then off-label use is probably considered sort of a bonus, if you will. I mean, I think it's not taken into account, especially for the more expensive drugs that many people have been focusing on lately, because payers tend to limit off-label use for those medications through prior authorization and pre-certification processes. And they may limit it not just to the label, but to other things that are for which there's good evidence. But I think that most manufacturers are not counting on off-label use for the more expensive drugs these days.
It does highlight, I think, too, Ed, given that it's not just the list price of the drug, but as you said, the utilization review, the formulary requirements, where if it's an off-label indication, clearly communication around the evidence relevant to those decisions has very important implications for prices and patient access. And as you move to the models that you described that are not about sort of a set price for a drug, but a price that depends on the evidence on the indication, or a price that depends on the results, the ultimate results associated with the drug, again, those kinds of communications seem very important. Well, I want to thank all of you for a great discussion. We ran a little bit over, but I think this has been extremely helpful for setting the context and setting up our next panel. That panel is going to talk about some of the options presented in the report, and I think we'll generate some further discussion as well. We're going to take a 10-minute break before we move on to that. So we'll reconvene here about 10:37, 10:38, something like that. Right on time, right on the nose, right? 10:38. But in the meantime, I'd like to thank our panel and Ed for doing the extra duty of participating long distance. Thank you all very much.